Migrating to Australia, the only podcast that you can find on the Apple, Google, and myriad other podcast directories that discusses the essential and the informative and comedic aspects of Australian visas. And today, I'm joined by David Bongiorno, Australia's um, most rough-hewn migration agent. For those of you
looking like a candidate for Movember. Thank God no one watches us. Everyone listens to us, but the beard is. This is 2 weeks of beard. Not bad.
And I'm Grant Williams. I just put this this thing together, and David, we're
going up a notch. We're going up a notch, Grant.
Well, we're joined by one of the persecuted, a pen-pushing bureaucrat.
We've got Nick Guru-Prasad, and then Nick is working with Invest Victoria, and he has the wonderful job of attracting investment, foreign investment from India, Middle East, North Africa. Nick, it's great. And how long have you been doing this? It's a noble task to attract investment to our state. How long have you been doing it for?
Well, for almost 15 years now, David. Started off in India, in the Victorian government Indian office, and that was way back in 2005. And now with 2020, I'm doing pretty much the same thing, but at the other side of the fence, so to speak.
David, isn't that a pathway that I don't think I've ever thought of before, that you can get a job in your home country working for the Australian government or Victorian government or a state government or a quango, a quasi government body, and find yourself, a 10 or a dozen years later, in COVID Central in Melbourne.
Well, we'll get into your migration background, Nick. Did you come on a work visa? We'll talk about it later, but did you come on a work visa or study and then move through the study pathway?
On a work visa.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
All right.
Yeah.
Now, Invest Victoria we want to start with, and people who know about Invest Victoria know about it. There'll be people who are listening who don't know about it, and it might pique their curiosity. It's essentially a full government body designed to attract investment to the state. In a nutshell, is that what? Tell us about it in greater detail.
Sure. So Invest Victoria is the Victorian state government's economic development agency. We sit within the Department of Treasury and Finance, and our primary role is to work with international companies across a range of industry verticals who might be interested in exploring opportunities in the growing Australia-New Zealand marketplace, and are evaluating, which location in the region might be best placed for them to service those opportunities in the medium to long term, right?
Now you've been doing this for how long now?
Almost 15 years.
And challenging times to be doing it now. How has the last year been for you in comparison to, say, last year, which migration-wise was a terrific year? How has it been this COVID year?
Look, as I mentioned, we work with companies across a range of verticals, and there are certain priority verticals that we've designated to ourselves, primarily focused on what Victoria's traditional strengths have been. So the answer to your question, David, is depending on which sector you look at. If you're, of course, looking at everything related to pharma, medtech, and healthcare, well, parts of it from a delivery point of view is in crisis, but that's where most of the market opportunities are for now and for a good time to come, right? So beyond a certain stage around presenting value proposition to overseas investor companies as to why Victoria or Melbourne could be their Australian, if not their Asia Pacific home. We get into the next level of looking at what industry verticals or sectors that they're from, and provide very, very tailored services to their requirements, right? That said, as you rightly said, COVID's presented a significant number of opportunities. With the borders closed, there's only so much that we could assist overseas companies by way of wanting to set a footprint into this market, or expand on their existing presence. But that said, I think the beauty of working remotely has also helped us ensure that we get to meet everyone that we want to, right? Unlike in the pre-COVID world, when people used to say they're boarding a plane and they won't be available, or they're in a different time zone. The good part of COVID is, no matter where they are, you can eyeball them like we're doing today, right?
Nick, can I ask for a bit of clarification? I heard you say the body is set up to sort of facilitate investment in Australia and New Zealand, and that it sounds like you are working for the companies who are interested. Like I understand you work for the Victorian government. I get that, but your role, if I got it right, is that you're basically doing the research that a company would need to do to be able to understand if an opportunity exists for them in this region. So they might not be doing that as a matter of course in their normal operations, but you guys identify a potential opportunity for an investment into Victoria, and then reach out to them and do a lot of that initial fact finding for them. And then when they tell you their specific needs, you narrow it right down for them. Is that how the process goes?
Yeah, Grant, good question. That's one part of what we do, but there's a lot more, that goes into trying to help an overseas investor look at setting up a presence for the region. And when I mentioned Australia, New Zealand, it was the region that overseas companies usually look at servicing by way of market opportunities, and of having a particular location, in the ANZ or even the Asia Pacific region as their hub, by way of reaching out and servicing those opportunities, right? And of course, we position Melbourne as the preferred Australian home, not only because we were voted as the world's most livable city for 7 years in a row, but because it makes business sense to companies, right? And that's where we engage with overseas companies on a proactive basis. That's one way we reach out to companies, and once we have informed view of their intention to look at overseas markets, and if Australia could be one such location they might be focusing on, or we could bring the focus onto Australia and then Victoria. But also the second part of it is also companies who are interested, have done a bit of their own homework by way of wanting to enter this market, but have several unanswered questions, as any company would, wanting to enter a new market. And that's where, as a government organization, we hold them through the process, depending on what the project might be, by way of what the say facilitation process might be, what the approvals might be. Of course, that all goes to perhaps a manufacturing related opportunity, or a planning related opportunity, but there could also be several services related opportunities, given that Victoria is primarily a services state. Our strength is around knowledge based sectors like technology and life sciences and healthcare. So several of the investments that we've facilitated from the Indian market, for example, are in the technology space, right? And their primary focus is around trying to better understand what is the access to talent that we could help them with, right? And it's by no coincidence that we call it as an education state, given that we're full of universities and TAFEs and other educational institutes. So organizations like us, economic development agencies like us, connect or act as a bridge between what potential investor companies into Australia want to achieve. We help them with the how of it. How can we help you achieve that? Or how can we help you better understand where you want to go in Australia, depending on what your short, medium, and long-term goals are.
Is there a sense of solidarity or a sense of friendly competition? If somebody came to you and you said, "Oh, look, we don't think you're right for Victoria, but you'd be fantastic in the Northern Territory," I mean, do you refer companies to each other, or is it we're all fighting for the same clients?
Yeah, good question, David. Look, there's a friendly competition, of course, between states, and I must also acknowledge that the private sector companies that we're all working with, and in many cases there could be more than one state who might be in conversation with these overseas private sector investor companies. They're quite smart enough as well. They do their homework too, and they broadly have an idea as to where they might want to set up shop in Australia too. But that's where sometimes companies come to us for a bit of validation in terms of the homework that they would have done. Does it align with what government's view is as well, right? And if it does, then decisions get made. But there are also several instances where it's a bit of an open playbook in terms of there could be multiple locations that a company could go to depending on what they want to achieve in this market. And that's where we present a proposition based on pure cost of doing business metrics, for example, right? And the level of market access that they could have, not just in Victoria, but across Australia, New Zealand, or even across Asia Pacific, if they were to be based in Melbourne, right? Yeah. So look, that's how it works. But there've been a good number of times where we've been, when we're talking to companies where we think perhaps a better fit is one of our northern neighbors, and we do refer it to our colleagues in those states.
How essential is it for a company to come to you to open and to start business in Victoria? Is it crucial? Is it non-negotiable?
Well, look, yeah, there's no mandate for an overseas company to come to us for every project. There's certain projects if they have a comfort factor, and if they think that perhaps there's no role for government in this, by all means they can go ahead and invest and execute the project through their own network of service providers or ecosystem enablers that they might have access to, right? The question is to take it to the next level is depending on, again, what sector the project might be, the potential investment might be, right? If there's a specific role for government around regulatory approvals and a whole host of stakeholder management, for example, if it was an investment that could go to a regional area, and that's where perhaps local councils as well in the regions come into play. We have colleagues in regions as well whom we could bring together, and the advantage that overseas companies have would be we're a single point of contact within the Victorian state government, and based on what the project is, we bring in relevant internal stakeholders to the conversation, right? Which would be hard for, if a company would hire a private consulting firm to do the same job. It would be quite challenging.
And you guys don't charge.
Now, we don't charge for our services, so all our services are free and confidential. That said, of course, we work with a number of players across industries who are competitors. But what you tell us stays with us. It's in the vault, right? And that's where the business that we are in is the trust business, plus it's a long-term relationship. And more often than not, I must say, companies are fairly comfortable kind of working on this model, because at the end of the day, we don't have a commercial interest. It's about the commercial interest of a potential investor company that we want to attract to the state, as long as we think there's a good business value proposition, right?
Nick, if I'm a local business person looking to put together some form of conglomerate investment body to perhaps invest in Victoria, can I get for no charge from the government the same kind of information that a foreign business can get from you? Like you mentioned earlier, the cost of doing business in different sectors. Can I, as a local investor, secure that information free of charge?
Absolutely, Grant. Given that we're a government organization funded by the taxpayer, while our mandate as Invest Victoria is primarily foreign direct investment, there are other parts of the government that cater to investors in the domestic market, right?
I just want to clarify that, because I know that I've never had to deal with Victoria on this thing, but I know people have tried to get information out of the Australian government for those kind of things, costs for doing business, transactions, general costs for transport, all that kind of stuff that you need when planning out a medium term look for a business, and nothing comes for free. So I'm really pleased that the Victorian government is doing something that directly facilitates investment without putting a roadblock, a financial roadblock, in the discovery phase for a business. Just before David goes on with his next question, can I ask you, Nick, because you mentioned you moved to Australia, and it always gets lost because we talked about the 7 years of Australia, of Melbourne being the most livable city. Now you've had the experience of coming here and relocating. Why do you think Melbourne continually figures so high in the most livable city ratings across the world? And is it actually important?
Good question, Grant. Look, going by the rankings by The Economist, of course, they have their own methodology. Given that it's a global benchmark and not a regional benchmark, right? They have a set of parameters by which they measure different, cities across the world, and by virtue of that methodology, we've come on top for 7 years, and I think now we're the second most livable city. I think it's important on several counts, in terms of whether it's a business, or at the end of the day, while we're helping a business choose its Australian home and become an Australian employer, and start employing locals. It's also about certain key management positions within the foreign investor who are likely to move to Australia as well, as a part of starting the business, right? And that's where we've seen, consistently, of course, Melbourne's a preferred location for those CXOs of large multinational companies, right? In terms of wanting to live in a place, I think that gives them the balance of access to great schools for their family, for their kids, to being a relatively easy place to get around, no matter what your mode of transport might be, right? And also, I think in terms of the culture of the place as well, and given that Melbourne's the cultural and the entertainment and the foodie capital of Australia, and you can't get a better combination than that, isn't it? Plus, if you combine that from a more corporate point of view, we're more cost competitive than any other Australian capital city across the eastern seaboard, and having about 25% of Australia's market, pretty much in any industry that you might want to look at, makes it a bit of a compelling proposition to be based here.
You mentioned earlier, Nick, Victoria's traditional strengths. What are Victoria's traditional strengths for investors?
Right. Look, from an Invest Victoria point of view, we have focus on certain industry verticals, and we focus our time and effort, given that we don't charge for our services, but we still need to be mindful of where we spend our time. At the end of the day, we have a set of KPIs to meet as well. So the focus is on pharma and healthcare and medtech as one sector. Food and beverage or agribusiness is the other industry sector. Again, both of them that Victoria has been quite strong traditionally. Advanced manufacturing, given that Victoria has been the manufacturing state traditionally. Also, for energy being a big focus, given the current state of transition that we find ourselves in, and sometimes we're the envy of the world in terms of our location and the access to resources that we have, and the potential to become a renewable superpower that Australia has, right? But still, that transition is going to be slow, right? And that's a big focus for us as well as a sector. And technology, which is depending on whom you talk to, whether it's digital, they want to call it as digital or pure play information technology. That's another big sector for us, right? And underpinning all these sectors, I think, is our strong focus and foundation of education, and of having there's 9 Victorian universities plus a good number of research institutes, right, which places us in a very good position to work with large multinationals in the knowledge industry space.
You go, Ryan.
Nick, what's the sort of smallest size of a company that you might hook up with overseas? I'm sorry for that term too, but it seems like it's a fairly it just seems like you would be reaching out, looking for possibilities initially. So you're prospecting as much as they are, I'm guessing, at the start.
That's
and
right.
Then once the synergies are identified, you can sort of formalize any arrangements. But what's the smallest kind of company overseas that you might look to work with?
Look, again, being the government's economic development agency, we work with companies of all sizes, right? Whether it's a startup or a large conglomerate, right? The bigger question is, irrespective of the size of the company, what are they trying to achieve? What their ambitions for the region are, and what's their plan to achieve the end objective, right? So particularly over the last 5 to 7 years, we've worked with a good number of relatively smaller startups in the technology and the healthcare space. But as you'd be aware, particularly from Asian markets, startups are quite successful in raising significant external capital, right? and particularly in a country like India that I focus on. Traditionally, we've had technology startups who raise capital to look at venturing out into overseas markets rather than focusing on the Indian domestic market itself, which has of course changed over the last few years as India is recording its own growth story. They're focusing on the domestic market as well, but it's never a question, or not always a question, on it's whether the domestic market or overseas market, right? So it's both, given the pie is that big, right? It's just a matter of priority and timing with respect to which market they might want to address first and others later, right? So while we don't have a specific number to state in terms of whether it's number of employees or by way of revenue or turnover that we help companies, it's more about what they want to achieve and how big is their plan for the region, and whether they have all the other partners, so to speak, as whether they have a partnership in terms of trying to achieve that objective here, and where the government can actually lend a helping hand and try and help them realize their project, right?
It's a very generous, comprehensive, well-resourced service you offer. Are companies surprised by that? Do they have similar programs operating in India and the other territories you cover?
Look, absolutely, and more often than not, and it's more, I think, to the region that I focus on. There's a constant challenge on trying to kind of help Indian companies learn that they have access to these kind of services and information, which, as I said, is available free of charge on a confidential basis, right? And there's several times when companies actually are surprised when we meet them for the first time and tell them that, look, we're here to help, right? And these are the range of services that you have, and fire away with your questions, right? So companies are also on that learning curve on what's accessible through government agencies like us, and what's available for free, what's available perhaps at a charge. And to your second part of that question, yes, there's several other jurisdictions as well, operating in India. And in fact, the Victorian government has 2 offices in India as well, in Bangalore and Mumbai. But someone like a UK Trade and Investment or the Foreign Office of the UK, again, given the traditional relationship between India and UK, they've been there for like a good number of decades. But more so, there's several Canadian states as well that are very active in the Indian market, trying to do pretty much what we're trying to do as well, right? And that's where we come in terms of there could be companies that might have Australia or Victoria in their radar, but they might not have as well, right? And there's several such companies who might be looking at, setting up a specific technology initiative, for example, say maybe in the Nordics or in Northern America, right? And that's where we get into the picture as well and say that, look, if this is what you're looking at establishing in those regions, have you thought about Australia as well as, as an option? And if you haven't, we're here to help you answer those questions, where you can make a informed decision as to where you want to go, by way of the next overseas investment that you might be planning for.
I know it's a confidential service, but are there any brand names, public success stories that you can share with us?
Yeah, look, over the years, most of the investments that we've facilitated have largely been enterprise to enterprise brands. So, not every other name that I would mention now you might be aware of. The bulk of the investors, as I said, from India are all in the technology space. Companies like Infosys, Wipro, Tata's, Tech Mahindra, HCL. These are large technology firms from India that hire at least, at the moment they have at least about 150,000 plus people on their payroll globally, right?
Massive business, massive.
Yeah. and a significant number of them, have the headquarters here in Melbourne for the region, right? So look, these are largely enterprise names, but they're more in the technology and the life sciences space.
And do they, once they set up, do they like to transfer various parts of their business when they see how easy it is to do business in Victoria? Do they bring more of their business across?
Absolutely, and that's a part of our mandate as well. Once we've helped a overseas company, set up shop in Victoria and provided all assistance to that effect, it's the start of the relationship, not the end of the relationship or the end of the project. That's where our new mandate would be to help them grow further in Victoria, right? And how we could try and perhaps bring in other functional roles from the other markets that they might be operating in, into Victoria, right? A good example of that is a company like Wipro, that set up shop way back in 2009 in South Melbourne, with our assistance. We worked closely with him last year, by way of attracting the first cybersecurity defense center for Asia Pacific for Wipro down here in Melbourne. Right?
Beautiful.
Yeah, and they're hiring at least 100 local staff just for that cyber defense center. Right.
It's fantastic. And I mean, as they build their business here and take from their home country and to their new adopted country, what's the feedback you get? Oh, Nick, doing business here is so much better than doing business in India because X, Y. What is some of the feedback you get?
The feedback, again, that varies based on what industry vertical the companies is focusing on, because it would vary from one region to the other. But I think the general feedback that we get cutting across industry verticals is the fairly black and white approach towards doing business in Australia, right? It's of course an expensive place to do business, right? With the average or the minimum wage in Australia perhaps being one of the highest globally. But that said, companies appreciate that it's fairly black and white here, unlike other markets where it's hard to hard to essentially draw a line and say that, look, these are the regulations, yes, but it's not as black and white as it is in Australia, right? So that's the very positive feedback that we get, despite it being an expensive location to do business.
Any negative feedback?
Sorry, David, can I just follow up on that point that Nick made about Australia being expensive to do business? I hear that often, but I would contend that if you actually take all the costs of living and all the things like medical insurance and just the general environment of risk in Australia and in Melbourne, the cost of business is not so high. It's only if you're looking at the raw cost of doing business. So I just wonder why we always perpetuate that idea that it's expensive here. It's not expensive if you look at all of the social good that you get that you don't have to directly pay for just being here in Australia. So any company that is here long term is going to have it's going to have healthier workers. It's going to have longer lived workers. It's going to have better educated workers if they're drawing from the local population. So why do we perpetuate that it's expensive to do business in Australia?
You're spot on, Grant, but the key term in what you just said, the key couple of words is if companies are here for the long term, right? So the key word is long term, right? And I must say, when when we're in conversation with companies that don't have a presence in this market and are wanting to set up a presence, usually from a first 3 years profit and loss, statement point of view, right? With a minimum wage of almost $19.50 per hour, right? I must tell you, that's perhaps the biggest cost that companies have to take care of coming from Asian markets. As I said, my perspective is more from an India or an Asian point of view, right? And to account for that kind of a cost as a minimum wage, right? With the potential pipeline that they might have at the moment, and a conversion ratio in the first 3 years, right? Because at the end of the day, I think the primary challenge for any company coming into the market is, if you have your first 3 years sorted out, you'll be here for the medium to long term, right? And the trick is around that first 3 years, and that's where we've had several of the Indian companies, quite obviously, as in it's a very different cost model back in India. But also, if you look at the US, right, the average minimum age is nowhere close to what it is here in Australia, right? So from an access to talent point of view, where the talent pool is much bigger in the US, and I'm talking more from a tech industry perspective at this stage, tech companies find it that it's a lot more expensive to hire talent here, right? That said, that you could offset it by several other factors around. It's a great place to live, so you might be paying a lot more to hire talent, but the trend is that they're going to stick on for much longer, right?
I'd be happy to stand corrected, but I think if you're looking at general risk for a startup or a small to medium enterprise in Australia versus the US, we come out miles ahead in terms of just being a risk just to start up. I'm not talking about a massive company, but for a small enterprise, 5 to 15 to 30 employees, that we're a far less risky proposition on any metric.
No, we are a far less risky proposition in some ways, Grant, but also, again, this is based on, what we get to hear from companies of various sizes whom we talk to on pretty much on a daily basis. The sales cycle, for example, in the Australian context is much, much longer than perhaps what it's in the US, right? So it again
is better. So it's harder at the front end, but it's a better payoff at the back end.
That's right. So, it again goes back to that first 3 years, right? For them to crack those first 3 years and have a healthy set of customers that they're servicing, plus a healthy pipeline that they can convert over a period of time, right? And the cost of making that happen, right? Given that this is, again, a relatively small market when compared to the US or the UK or in general Europe, I think that's where the challenges do come up, right? But again, I think thanks to COVID and I think the way our governments have responded to it and have contained it, I think we have a fairly positive outlook or positioning amongst overseas investors, right, compared to other jurisdictions.
Can you offer a comment about the new trade agreement that's just been signed? How do you think that will impact the success or otherwise of your role?
Are you referring to the RCEP, the regional?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Look, that's an interesting one for me to comment on, given that I focus on India, because India has consciously stayed out of it. And that's due to, again, various reasons and the way I think the Indian economy in general is structured and the threats that India sees by way of aligning with this kind of trade agreement. But in general, I think particularly when it comes to free trade agreements, that's something that we've leveraged to our advantage, right? and more so as in many of my colleagues who look after the European and the US markets. It's a very, very compelling proposition for American and European companies to address the Asian market through Australia, at least to start with, right? And the free trade agreements that Australia has with a number of Asian countries places us in a very, very good position, by way of, building that long-term outlook to access Asian markets from Australia, right? I must also mention the Victorian government has its own international network as well. As I mentioned, offices in India, in Bangalore and Mumbai, but 23 offices globally. Two of them in India and one in Dubai for the Middle East. But cuts across, 5 offices in China, 5 in the US for obvious reasons, biggest trading partner and biggest investor. And then, presence in other key markets as well across Asia and Europe.
You mentioned we were going to dip into the negative aspects, and we touched on one: cost of employment, salaries, wages. What is some of the negative feedback you get about other negative feedback you get dealing with foreign companies doing business in Australia? What's some of the other negative things they talk about with you?
In terms of trying to enter the Australian market?
And doing business here when they do enter the market.
Yeah, look, one is, again, the challenge around, the duration of the sales cycle, and more often than not, the companies that I tend to deal with, which are largely Indian technology companies who have had a presence in the US and UK or a general Europe, right? And then look at coming into Australia, right? Many of them come with the mindset that, look, Australia is just a very small subset of what the US and the UK market is, right? Which it is in some ways, but in several other ways it isn't, right? And the sales cycle is I think one part of that challenge, right? And because decision making, again, from market feedback, what we hear is relatively slow in the Australian market when compared to the US, right? But again, that's something that government has no direct control over. And the only way we can try and offset that is to try and present a proposition of being based in a cost competitive location while you try and go through the sales cycle, right? So that's been the negative feedback that we've had. But again, as I said, there's not much that we can do about it as government.
In terms, just let's touch very briefly, very generally on visas. When these companies come, are they coming for permanent residency by way of the 132 visa, or are they looking to play the long term, depending on eligibility, of course, are they looking at the provisional 188 visa? Just very general terms.
Yeah, look, we've had companies, leverage all the different categories of visas, 132 and 188 as well. But the ones that I've dealt with, again, from a technology industry's point of view, is many of them leverage the TSS visa, the talent visa, with the 2-year and the 4-year option. And with the 4-year option, of course, with a distinct pathway to residency, right? That's been very popular, and many of these large technology firms do have, I gather, a direct relationship with Department of Home Affairs, where there's a quicker approval for their applications. Also, in the very recent past, we've had significant interest from overseas markets to take the global talent visa route, particularly the focus sectors and the subsectors within technology that the global talent visa focuses on. Fintech, agtech, medtech, advanced manufacturing, for example, cybersecurity, all things digital. And that's been very, very popular, given the fact that it's also a fast track to permanent residency.
Now, you deal to what percentage of your territory is India? Is it 75, 80% or?
Look, pretty much, I would say about 75 to 80%. That's a fair share. Yeah.
Now, when Indian businesses and staff of Indian businesses move and set up in Australia and take permanent residency, they forgo their right to be Indian citizens and take the OCI card. Does that compromise in any way their capacity to do business back home?
Good question. Not that I'm aware of, David. Many of them have taken that, the path towards, getting an OCI. But also I hear, and again, nothing confirmed, but I hear from, Indian government sources saying that, the Modi government in India is potentially looking at having dual citizenship as well.
That'd be fantastic. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah. I'm not sure as in how much of a priority that is for the Indian government at this stage. But I've heard in the past that that could be a possibility at some time in the future.
Hey,
now,
David,
Grant,
just imagine that we haven't been doing this for several years.
I was about to cross to Nick and talk about Nick now.
Well, just imagine that you and I have not been doing this together for several years.
50 shows.
And that I was putting myself in the place of a dumb listener. What's an OCI, David?
Overseas citizen of India. And it's a card. I mean, I don't think I've ever had an Indian client not become a citizen, Nick. I don't think once I've got PR, 1 year later, so long as they satisfy the requirements, straight up for citizenship. And that's why I've always wondered, does the OCI card allow them to do what they've been doing prior, or is it they're cutting that off? Like I understand it's an identity card and it gives them essentially equal rights, but does it prohibit them from doing things that they used to do, owning property? I don't know.
Look, I'm not aware of that, and again, that's an area where we don't really get into because that's not our focus. Yeah.
No, of course. Now you've been here. How long have you been a permanent resident or citizen? You're a citizen now?
No, look, I've just completed barely 3 days back of being a resident for a year. So I think I'd be eligible to apply for citizenship. So I'm a resident as of now.
Fantastic. How long have you been a resident for?
Yeah, just over a year. So
sorry,
year.
I got a phone call. It cuts out StreamYard, so I lost your answer before. I apologize if I'm repeating.
No, that's right. Look, it's been a year and I think 3 days, if I'm not wrong, since I've been a resident.
Fantastic.
And on a personal note, are you a bird nerd? Are you into birds?
We talk about the feathered kind here, Nick.
Because I'm sure that those melodic tones are coming through your microphone. So I wondered if you've got a minor bird or something in a cage nearby.
No. But look, where I live is in a good number of trees around, and I think it's that time of the evening. They're all going back home, so
you've got
making some noise.
Blackbirds and the minor birds singing out. So
yeah.
Minor birds are very popular in India. So I thought that might have been one of your family traditions to keep one. So.
Now, what visa did you come out on, Nick?
I came on a work visa.
402 or 457?
457.
Okay, and then by way of 186.
Yes, so my employer nominated me to get a residency. Yeah,
fantastic.
Yeah, that's 186, I think. I'm sorry, I'm bad with the numbers. Yeah,
no,
it's
that's
employer nomination.
Employer sponsored. Yeah, fantastic.
Yes,
and you came from Bangalore.
Was that the Victorian government sponsoring?
Yeah, look, one of the departments that I.
Victorian government sponsor, fantastic, and that would have been a very smooth process in terms of the way the state and federal governments liaise with each other in this investment space and in the visa space, I know they work well together. Do you have any dealings on a day-to-day basis with the federal government in the work you do?
Look, absolutely. We work very closely with our federal colleagues in the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. And, there's several investment projects where we work as a team, by way of, trying to get the project to Australia, because that's the first hurdle you got to pass. And after that, of course, while we have a healthy competition, as I said, it's also as in, at the end of the day, up to the investor where they want to set up as well. So, while our federal colleagues have the mandate to try and, of course, get the project to Australia, we work at the next level along with our federal colleagues to try and see if Melbourne can be the best fit.
Now, we don't hear much. I mean, you have the Middle East and North Africa as part of your territory as well. Now, we don't hear much about North African or Middle Eastern investment in Victoria. Is it something the government's keen to develop?
Look, I think the government and Invest Victoria has an international investment strategy on our website, right? You can have a look at that. We keen to kind of work with several of the clusters across markets, and the same would apply to Africa as well. But again, I think emerging economies like Africa have their own challenges around trying to chart their own domestic growth story, right? And are currently in a phase where they're seeking more investment rather than they're investing into first world locations like Australia, right? That said, there's always that large, well-capitalized conglomerate who might have presence across several markets in the Middle East and Northern Africa, who would be interested in Australia for it, and those are the companies that we'd be working with, right?
Grant, you go.
Nick, you've been in Melbourne long enough now to know that we have to turn everything into sport. To understand anything, it has to have a sporting context. So, Who is our greatest opponent? Is it one of the Canadian cities? Is it a location somewhere in the US, or is it the Scandi dudes? Is it the Northern European socialist utopias?
Look, it's more the American ones, I would imagine. The North American ones, the Canadians. One of the experiences in terms of moving across to Melbourne, and of course with young kids, and my daughter, for example, is such a big fan of Richmond Tigers, right? And the first match that I took her, I think she was like 3 or 2.5 years old or whatever, and for the simple reason that it's Richmond Tigers, and she could relate to that because tiger is the national animal of India, right? And by default, she would want to barrack for Richmond Tigers. But that's such an essential fabric of, I think, the life in Australia in general, but Victoria, Melbourne in particular. It's a shame, of course, that the grand finals happened elsewhere this year, but it's such a part of the tradition here, isn't it?
It is.
And Canada and the US are crap at cricket.
Absolutely. Look, I've met several in this 15-year journey, and going. I've met several very, very well known, very well qualified people, who have made the decision to come to Australia for the simple reason that MCG is here, and they wanted to be in a first world country where cricket's a religion, right? They could have as well gone to the US or Canada with the kind of qualifications that they had and working for universities or global multinationals, but they made a choice to come to Australia. because of
We're going
cricket.
to have to strong arm Nick, David. We're going to have to strong arm Nick and see if Invest Victoria have access to a box for the Boxing Day test.
Well, I was going to ask you, Nick. 20 over games, 50 over games, test matches. Is there space for 3 games, or do you think one of them has to go?
No, I think there's space for all the 3.
You don't think there'll be a 30 over compromise for the 20 and 50 and 30 over in test match or anything like
we've
that?
already got the 10-10 going.
Oh God, I forgot about that. Forgot about that.
We've already got 4.
No.
Why stop at 4?
Nick, thanks. Have you had dinner, Nick?
Not yet. My dinner time is usually late in the day.
I better let you go and eat because I'm going to eat as well.
I can't let Nick go yet.
You got one more question for Nick?
I've got 2 nonsense questions for Nick, but they're all about Melbourne, Nick. Or one's all about Melbourne, one's all about Australia. What do you think of the trams, Nick?
Look, I think the great, just from an experience point of view, particularly coming from Asian markets, right? It's a great way to get around. Not that India doesn't have trams.
Is that code for you like them but not to travel on?
No. Look, it depends. From where you want to go, and more often than not, our offices are of course close to Parliament. But if you've got to go to Docklands for a meeting, that's the best way to go. Jump on a tram rather than, of course, if you have the time to walk and you're happy to walk, you can do that. But jump on a tram, you wouldn't want to get on a cab or even drive or whatever.
And as a relatively new arrival, Nick, like within the sort of 2 or 3 year period, you've been here about a year. How long did it take from when you got off the plane at Tullamarine before you went to see a kangaroo?
That is a nonsense question.
Yeah, look, that was way back, I think, in my first trip to Australia in 2006 when I first visited. And I was, of course, quite excited to see a kangaroo and was very disappointed not to see a kangaroo until I went to, where did I go? I went to the Melbourne Zoo.
Yeah. Were you waiting for traffic to stop while they popped across the road, were you?
Yeah, look, coming from India, you would think that, just like how you kind of have monkeys kind of jumping in India, not in every other street, but pretty much, you can find it's not too hard to find a monkey in the suburbs. You would imagine perhaps you would see that you'd get to see kangaroo in every other suburb.
Get back, Skippy. Stop that.
Nick, thanks for joining us. Nick Guru Prasad from Invest Victoria. Thanks for stopping by.
No, my pleasure. Thanks, David and Grant, for having me.
Have a great night.
Nick. It's been great. Now, David, we have to do a bit of an update. Because last week we were speaking and we were all, we were really, really hopeful. We were glowing. The possibilities of international students coming looked very, very close. And we were talking about next year, next semester. But I think that's been blown completely out of the water.
Well, I think the pilot program is about to start for the Northern Territory, and they're bringing in students who were here. And I think that pending the success of that, the South Australian government's going to follow that their pilot programs, and we will get international students back. I mean, as Nick said earlier in the podcast.
Have I picked up on something that you didn't pick up on? On the same day that Minister Tudge was in the headlines for other reasons.
Oh, we won't talk about that.
There was an announcement or a statement. I'm not sure how we would classify it, but the government said that we should not be expecting to be welcoming international students back anytime in the near future. I think they use something like the foreseeable future as their term. So that knocks out semester 1 and I think probably semester 2 next year, because we won't be having a vaccine widely circulated till the end of next year.
A lot of the
Yep.
big schools, were budgeting on June, weren't they? Mid semester next year, midterm.
So
What do
sorry
you-
to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt, guys, but I got to go. If that's all right.
Yeah, ciao,
go
Nick.
Go.
All right.
Thanks for coming. Ciao, man.
No, look, thank you. See you then. Good night.
Ciao.
Right.
I think, Grant, I think that the pilot program will go ahead, if not now, later, to bring them back, and they're going to be quarantined anyway. So I always think that the pilot program to bring those who were here back was not predicated on a vaccine, rather on quarantine.
Well, now
But the students who want to come here, God knows when the students who want to come
Australia's
here.
got an outbreak, and it's come from hotel quarantine. So,
Jeez, I know. Can you believe that? I saw that.
well, I can
saw that.
totally believe it, because people have been carrying on as if these things are foolproof. You know, we're in a pandemic and viruses spread. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm amazed that people think that you can make a decision and that fixes everything. It doesn't. People don't behave in rational ways. I still haven't been out to get a haircut. I still think that
Oh,
people
look,
are mental around here.
the premier's talking about removing masks for outdoor activities. I'm going to be walking around with my blue and white checked mask until I'm ready to take it off.
I'll be wearing mine, but unfortunately, we've seen this week that people are now starting not to comply because they think it's over. And I can remember, David, when we finished our first lockdown, and I was talking to you, and I said I'd just been to the supermarket, and my supermarket is in a shopping centre, and I said to you, we're going to be right back there because people are walking through in threes, you know, arm in arm, and all this. I said everyone just thinks it's over.
No, not over. Not over.
So the reason I brought up the international students was that we were quite hopeful last week, but
look, I'm hopeful too. I can't wait for them to come back. I can't wait for them to come back because, you know, they bring so much vitality, energy, and enthusiasm and drive to the country. We miss them dearly on this show.
No, well, we both agree on that. But to my ears, the government, I reckon, stomped on that. They are going ahead with the South Australian trial, but of course now South Australia, who knows, in 2 weeks' time, well, most 4 states have just closed off the borders to their borders to South Australia. So
I remember South Australians were quite hostile to Victorian drivers attacking cars with Victorian number plates, and you know,
Twitter's always a good place to poke fun at those dirty Croaters. But in all seriousness,
we wish that they get it under control as quickly as we did. Yeah. Or as thoroughly. The better description is as thoroughly as we did. Next Migrating to Australia podcast, we're going to talk to a business lawyer about opening up a business in Australia, what you need to consider. Now, we just spoke to Nick, and obviously the difference is that Nick deals with established corporations, established businesses, significant investors. We're talking about people who migrate here, whichever means they do, and they want to open a business.
If you're an overseas podcasting behemoth, if you've got hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to invest in Australia, in Melbourne, you can short circuit the process. You don't need to speak to Nick.
Talk to Grant.
That's Grant at Migrating to Australia podcast. So,
mate,
how should anyone wanting to invest in a new global outreach immigration firm in Melbourne get in touch with?
If anyone, look, the quickest way to get in touch with me is Twitter, direct message, Twitter at David Bongiorno, DavidBongiorno, David Bongiorno. And I love Twitter dearly. It's my favorite medium. I'll tell you what I'm become very fond of, Lima. That's the voice cast app out of Ireland. Have you seen Lima? And so it's social audio. So I don't get my rough-hewn head on the tube, but my mellifluous, sometimes mellifluous voice. That's a great little app. That Lima,
try that.
L-I-M-O-R. Have a look.
It does sound like an awful lot of others that have gone before it. So I will.
It's an Irish one, and the Irish are very loquacious, so you can hear some fantastic stories.
And Ireland is, of course, a tax haven, so I'd hate to think that it was just some tax dodge startup for some tax refugee from some other country.
I'm off for dinner. Have you had your dinner?
I've had the first part of my dinner. I'm going to go and watch Foyle's War.
I haven't seen it. Have a good night, mate.
Mate, how could you not have seen Foyle's War?
No.
Oh, actually, I'll have to edit this good bit out. Have you watched that movie that's on SBS at the moment that they're cycling through called The Captain?
No.
Oh, man. German movie. A deserter comes across a car stuck in some mud, and in the car is a pristine captain's uniform, Nazi uniform.
Yeah.
So he puts it on, and another soldier walking up the road thinks he's the captain. So he drives around commandeering all these deserters and people who have lost their regiments, and he just goes around ordering them to do stuff. And because he's got a Nazi uniform on, no one cares. It's bizarre. So if you got a few hours in it, you know how they do the movies on World Movies on SBS, they'll just cycle through.
Yeah.
I
I'll have a look.
It's war at the moment, but they cycle through all the ones they've got on their list. Like my favorite Japanese movie called Our Little Sister. If you ever see that, you'll cry.
I don't want to cry. I spend too much time crying in movies. Really happy. Tears of joy. That's okay. I'm happy with tears of joy.
These three sisters have a father who has up and left them and gone off and created another younger sister, and at his funeral they meet her, and then she comes and lives with them, and it's really touching.
Fantastic.
Beautiful.
Fantastic.
And it's got all the cherry blossom motifs all the way through the movie. So
nice.
All right, we'll go and eat. I'm going to put this one out tomorrow, and that's why I didn't put out.
Yeah, beautiful.
Because of the stuff we said about international students, didn't want to put that out with us going, oh yeah, it's all going to be great, and then
fair enough.
And I'm sure they only put out the statement to cover up that Tudge is a prick. So.
Yeah, we won't go into that, but that's politics. Tell me something. When the phone with StreamYard, the telephone call, I got a call on my mobile and it overrode StreamYard, so I lost what Nick was saying. Is there any way I can stop the phone overriding StreamYard, or does it always automatically override?
I would say you just put it in aircraft mode or whatever.
But then there's no internet.
There's
no internet then.
Well,
because that's what, when I fly up to Sydney, I do my email on aircraft mode, and then turn it on. It goes ping, 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 and I machine gun out as on the tarmac all the emails are done.
Maybe do not disturb mode will work. Mode. I don't know, but
because I lost how long Nick had been here, and I couldn't really. It'll probably sound nonsensical.
He'd been here a year. He's only been here 12 months.
Okay, sweet. All right.
So yeah,
all right.
Yeah, that was good. I love that his daughter is into the Tigers.
That's fantastic. Yeah. You know what? I tell you what. Dom's got into it big time now, and has renounced soccer, much to my horror.
No. Don't let him renounce it. He can still he can listen to on the weekends at night after he goes to bed. Put on the BBC World Service and listen to the.
Oh, it's fabulous.
EPL broadcast, and then keep up with gossip.
It's better. It's better than the TV. Listening to it on the BBC or Radio 5 Live, far more exciting.
5 Live I sometimes put on, but I just like listening to Sports World. I listen to BBC every night, but I love
That's great.
listening to
That's
Sportsbet,
great.
and especially when they interview Australian people, and the Australian sports people say very different things when they're speaking to an audience that they think is not their domestic audience.
Oh,
It's
really? Do they behave? They're quite articulate. They open their mouths.
Oh, they're just a bit more expressive. Here, when they're speaking to the Australian, it's always, oh yeah, just taking it 1 week at a time. Yeah,
How good is that? Yeah, the boys did really well. We'll take each game as it comes.
But whether they're one of the hockey roos or a swimmer or whatever, they all trot out the same rubbish.
Yeah,
when they're speaking to Australians. But if they're speaking to the BBC, they talk about all sorts of other things.
I love it.
Bloody
I love it.
All right, mate.
Mate, you have a good one. I'll talk to you later.
I'll hit you up for a time tomorrow. We'll test your Instagram. For
Beautiful.
streaming.
Beautiful. Ciao, mate.
Cool,
Ciao. Thanks, mate.